Hello? Yes, great. We've got some sound. So welcome to our first climate action session. As you can see here, the topic is facilitating climate action through professional associations or organisations. So just a bit of background when planning for this session, a key thing that stood out in our mind, that what came out through interviews with people from across built environment sectors, was that the professional associations and organisations were very trusted sources of information about climate change, and that they also often talked about workshops that professional associations and organisations ran, and also lots of people talked about membership of different organisations as being a key part of their network professionally. And so some research that I'd done with colleagues, Patrick Cobbiner and Judy Bush, we looked at some people, we did a survey of urban planners and also of curriculum documents for urban planning degrees across Australia, and we found that climate change wasn't very prominent in curriculum or a core at all. And this corresponded in the survey to people saying, 90% saying, I know about climate change, but when it came to questions about having skills for climate change or capacity, the percentages went much lower. So part of this discussion was also to say, well, how can we use these sort of trusted organisations and professional associations to help build that capacity that people feel they are lacking? And another research that Alan March and Jetney Robbins and I did over 10 years ago found that professional association requirements for curriculum for accrediting bodies was a key to see change happening. So we sort of see this key role that professional associations and organisations play in helping facilitate change across different built environment sectors. And so this is why we wanted to hold the panel to hear from people working often voluntarily with different associations. So what we're going to do is each of the panel members will introduce themselves and the different professional association or organisation that they're representing today. And then we'll also open up later. I've got a few questions, but we'll open up to questions from the audience and we'll use a microphone for those. So think about some questions as we're going. So first I'll start with you, Naomi.
Hello, everyone. I'm Naomi Barun. I'm the Victorian President of the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects. I've been in the role for about 18 months, and I suppose one of my main priorities that has come out is AILA does a lot of advocacy, and we do a lot of advocacy through our members, and at a national level, the Victorian chapter hadn't been necessarily leading in an advocacy way. We were sort of taking a more of a reactive role, and we had some great advocacy happening in terms of submissions, but not necessarily getting out there and putting a position forward and then just pushing that out as fast as we can. So there's a bit of a re-energising at the moment that's happening, a bit slower than we'd like, but that's okay. And, outside of AILA, I'm what I'd call a landscape-based urban designer. So sort of fundamentally believing in organising ourselves in cities in a very different way to the way it's happening now. And I think landscape architecture knowledge is kind of fundamental to that in terms of the living systems, in terms of, that connection to nature, and particularly in terms of, we're essentially designing that fabric that is part of the social binding of our communities. And I think, from a president point of view or from an executive point of view, it is about that collective agency that comes from the membership and our role in channeling that energy, but importantly, how we use the projects that our members deliver and that agency of design and the role of the association or AILA in amplifying those messages and using that as evidence. But importantly, the other kind of big pillar is around legacy. As a member organisation, we are volunteers, so there is change. We have some amazing champions, but we also lean on those champions quite often. And so we need to know where we've come from, not just the impact that we're having, because otherwise we kind of tend to rehash things or restart things rather than continue them. So that's where I'm at the moment in terms of, particularly from a Victorian point of view. There's obviously a huge amount of advocacy happening across the states and at a national level, but in terms of Victoria being one of the bigger chapters, we're really trying to push that advocacy to be more proactive rather than waiting for those, notices to say, hey, respond to our submission.
Okay. Both of us hate microphones, so excuse my... so my name's Jane Keddie. I'm the current Vice President of the Victorian chapter of the Planning Institute of Australia, and I also lead their Policy and Advocacy subcommittee. So I'm pretty heavily involved in climate change advocacy through the Planning Institute. I think it's almost inevitable, as my interpretation of planners, two of the things, or even maybe the one fundamental thing that we're interested in is the long-term and long-term sustainability. And if we're interested in long-term sustainability, then inevitably we have to turn our minds to climate change and how our systems, our regulations, etc., need to respond to climate change. So just for a bit of context, PIA has a kind of a national body and a national organisation, and they're the ones who look after things like the accreditation systems that Anna's talked to. At a local level in Victoria, it's really focused around what are our systems looking like, what's our regulation looking like, what are the really critical issues and things that need to change in Victoria. One of the things that I've really been pushing over the last few years since I've played a role in PIA is being much more proactive. So similar to what Naomi's talking about, we've moved away from just responding when policy is put out to being much more proactive in terms of articulating what does good practice look like, what's PIA's position in terms of whether it's bushfire hazard, whether it's responding to climate change and the like. So there's a real, I guess for me, a real synergy between the work I do in private practice. I'm a consultant like Naomi, so I'm the director of a planning and design consultancy called Hansen Partnership, and as part of that work, I do a lot of work around climate change, and I've done work across adaptation, mitigation and the like. And one of the amazing things I think about things like professional industry associations, and at least one of the key drivers for me in terms of taking on a role in an industry association is that, as practitioners, often we're working on a particular problem, or we're working within a brief that we're provided. And one of the things that an industry association lets you do is it lets you take a step back. And it lets you think about, well, what are the principles here? What are the really key systematic changes that need to happen to mean that I could have done a better job on that particular project, or I had the tools that I needed to work to actually implement that particular change that are missing from our system. So, that industry lens really lets you advocate for those kind of systemic changes that you might not have the agency to do so in your practice. PIA is really active in the climate change space, so we've been really fortunate. There's been a lot of research done from the national level in terms of what the key issues for planners are, and again, based on what I said before, unsurprisingly, climate change, housing, two critical issues for planners. So climate change is obviously a key focus in terms of our advocacy. So been really lucky that the work that we've done at a local level in Victoria has been really strongly supported by work that's happening at national level. So there's national level policy that's actually being delivered around things like planning's role in adaptation, planning's role in mitigation, and there's papers that are available in terms of the role that planning plays in terms of those that have been delivered at national level. And what that means is that then at local level, we can turn our minds to, well, what does that mean in terms of the specific changes that we need to see and be advocating for in Victoria? So we've done quite a bit of work in that space, and I won't go into all of it, but there is things like we've developed position papers that I talked to. We've also worked hard in terms of building networks and collaboration, and we might talk to this a little bit later, but for instance, we released a joint statement on climate change. I think, Paul, you were part of that process. So I ran a workshop that involved various peak bodies, including ALR, AIA, the MAV and PIA, and we all signed a joint statement around things that we all saw as priorities, and that gives you really good leverage in terms of that advocacy. We also appear in front of parliamentary inquiries, so really getting planning's role and the importance of planning into the forefront of decision makers' minds, because one of the key pieces of our advocacy, and I might talk to this a little bit later, but I think there's not always an understanding of the critical importance of getting things right at the planning stage in order to see that action. And I think some of the work that Anna's been doing has probably talked to that really getting those key decision makers thinking about what role planning plays and why it's so important to get the planning right is a big part of our advocacy.
Thanks. Thanks, Jane. Thanks.
Thanks for having me. Is that working? So my name is Natasha Palich. I'm the Executive Officer of the Council Alliance for a Sustainable Built Environment. So not a professional association per se, but certainly an organisation bringing groups together to effect change. So we are an unincorporated governance structure, if you like. We operate under the auspices of the Municipal Association of Victoria, and we bring together councils who are interested in seeking sustainable outcomes in their built environment using the planning system as a mechanism. And so we also advocate in ways similar. We are a Victorian-based association, and our membership is currently comprised of 43 of the 79 councils in Victoria, representing about 80% of the population and about 77% of planning activity that goes on in Victoria. So our advocacy, as I said, it's reactive, it's direct, and it occurs in many ways. But one of the ways it does occur is through practical application. And so the councils involved in CASBE have over the years worked on and brought into play a local environmentally sustainable development policy. The first ones came in 2015, took about 7 or 8 years for that to occur. But since then, there's been another 20 plus policies that have come in. So what CASBE's been able to do is to capture and harness the energy or the resourcing that's gone into something like that. So we talked in the last session about the importance of policy, and these councils in Victoria are doing exactly that. They are implementing policy. And since this local policy was put into place in 2015 first time, of course things have changed. That policy had a focus on mitigation. We know that planning is one of the most effective tools for adaptation and resilience, and so there are changes that can be made to that policy. So one of the most significant advocacy efforts I've ever been involved in was a couple of years ago when these councils worked together and 24 councils submitted a planning scheme amendment to the state government within 2 hours on the same day. Same planning scheme amendment, and it wasn't a local government instrument because since the planning scheme was, streamlined, the policy instrument tools available to council have lost some of their ability to deliver what's needed. So these councils put up a proposal for a state policy instrument. I'm not a planner, but I understand that's quite significant. So this is I think that this association, this alliance, is a great example of advocacy through practical action.
Hi, I'm Paul Zanatta, and thank you, Natasha. I'm National Advocacy and Policy Manager at the Australian Institute of Architects. Today, in my short presentation, I'm going to talk about a particular initiative, but I wanted to say that I think that as a professional association, what the Institute is able to do with 14,500 members is both externally facing in terms of its advocacy, both to government and to lots of stakeholders in the built environment sector, but also its internal focus. It's very important what professional associations that deal with licensed or registered practitioners, it's very important what we do in terms of the capacity building in the profession itself. And then there is a reciprocity between that capacity building and then the voice of the profession that we give expression through our advocacy back to government. So there's really two aspects to it. There's an internal focus, and I'll talk a little bit about just one very small example of that capacity building focus today, but a very important one. And as well, there's also the issue of our external advocacy focus. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. So we'll open up to the audience soon for questions. And I think I've got some pre-prepared questions, but I guess the first one I'll start with is, you've touched upon some of these, but what are some examples of innovative actions that industry associations are implementing? And perhaps you can go into some detail of things that you might have just covered initially.
I feel like I'm always someone who starts, but I'll give you thinking time. I don't know so much if it's about innovation, but I do think there's a couple of initiatives that are maybe worth touching on in terms of some of the challenges that are faced and some of the ways of kind of getting around those. And I did touch on it before, but I think one of the key ambitions, I think, of some of our advocacy recently from the peer perspective has been really to try and ensure that our advocacy continually and consistently speaks to the critical role that planning plays. Many of you may be aware that, you know, in the current kind of climate of reform, planning's often kind of seen as this red tape thing that kind of gets in the way of development facilitation, etc. But it's actually a really critically important part of the process, is the research I think that you've done and it shows. But so our focus has been really on trying to ensure that basically through all advocacy that the Institute does, the link between planning decisions and climate change responses are kind of highlighted where those exist. And that's part of a narrative that we're establishing that really looks at the role that planning plays in terms of climate change responses as being, for most of the change that we need to see, and that I think, you know, this morning's sessions reiterated, you know, we know what needs to happen, we know what needs to change. The question is how we kind of make that happen on the ground, and that's why, you know, we have conversations like this. For me, and I think for the Institute, planning for all of those climate change responses, or for most of those climate change responses, is either foundational. So if you don't get the planning stuff right, you're starting from the back foot. So it's either foundational or it's enabling. And, you know, so an example of enabling, the enabling role of planning would be around things like, you know, renewable energy approvals, etc. So actually planning has a really critical role to play across almost all parts of the change that we need to see. So we've really tried to work So it's not so much a specific initiative, but it's a lens that we've tried to bring that really highlights through whatever part of kind of change or reform is being proposed, whatever we're responding to, that there's this ongoing narrative around the foundational and enabling role that planning plays, and therefore its critical importance in terms of that. And I've got to say, there was a panel report last week or the week before that talked specifically to recognising that critical role that planning plays, which was very nice to see. So I think that's one, that's on one kind of hand in terms of the narrative that we've looked to. I think another thing that's been really useful, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens, is occurring at national level, and that's a really strong partnership that's being built between the Planning Institute and the Insurance Council Australia. So in the adaptation space, obviously there's increased presence in discussion by the insurance councils. There's been a recent parliamentary inquiry, etc., into insurers, and so the insurance industry recognises that critically important role that planning plays, and in a lot of ways they're trying to kind of shift the dial on our responses, because we still, despite the policy settings, and I think in Victoria we've got quite a lot of quite good policy settings. It's the actual tools and the mechanisms and the application of those that tends to be the problem. But so the Insurance Council is a really important alliance, if you like, in terms of actually drawing a line in the sand in terms of some of those decisions, those land use decisions, particularly when it comes to climate risk, which I don't think we've fully grappled with. So those are two kind of quite different examples, but they are things that I think are going to bear, hopefully, bear some fruit in terms of the advocacy that the Institute's doing.
Thanks, Jane. So I guess any other initiatives to discuss, or even challenges that you've found in initiating? Yeah.
Go to the slides.
Yeah.
Is there a clicker?
No, there's not, but I'll do the clicking for you here.
So if we could go through to the first slide. So I just want to give you a little bit of background about the Australian Institute of Architects. We really had a marked increase in our climate action policies and strategic focus in the latter half of the 2010s. There was a climate action task force formed in 2020. It became our Climate Action Sustainability Committee reporting to National Council last year. In 2022, we committed to a net zero whole of life carbon position by 2040. We've been engaged in advocacy to building ministers for a new national policy for the built environment. These settings tend to ring fence all of our other policy and advocacy and our submissions. So this often gets re-expressed in many other pieces of submission, even if they're not directly climate action focused consultations. A critical success factor has been a climate action policy officer role since 2022. That really gives it a lot of energy in the Institute. And then, and what I'm going to speak to next is really our focus on equipping the profession and industry with the right tools, because the motivation is actually there. We don't need to motivate architects. It's just about giving the profession the tools. So next slide. So I just want to talk about one really small, this is part of a really big picture of work that's being done. But we launched last year our embodied carbon curriculum. There was contribution from partners including the Green Building Council of Australia, Neighbours and DQ, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. It's about cross-disciplinary education and industry-wide to establish a common language across sectors, 8 modules, multiple resources and learning activities. And in fact, our National President's here today. I think she's spoken a little bit to the Industry Decarbonisation Plan report. And so there'll be this will provide further impetus to this already brilliant program, which about 1,000 people have already undertaken. We'll go to the next slide. So this is actually available free for any built environment person. But if you pay for it, you can then have it undertake the required assessments to receive formal CPD points. And for architects, and we're really lucky, it's a nationally governed profession in terms of its competencies. We have the national standard of competencies for architects. That is governed by the Architects Accreditation Council of Australia, which has members from all the registration boards across the country. And so for your CPD requirements with each of the state and territory boards, if you pay to do the CPD, then you will receive, you'll go through the assessment process, so the summative evaluation of learning, and therefore you'll receive your certificate and your CPD points. But you can do it as informal CPD, and that's available for free. So anyone can do this. So these are the learning outcomes up here, and you can read those. I'll take you to the last slide. And the last slide is just, these are the modules. So focus on why, language, measuring, calculating, case studies, improving, practice and innovations. And if you actually go to the Q code there, the QR code, it will take you straight to the carbon curriculum, embodied carbon curriculum page. So that's just one very, very, very small example of some work that we're doing. We've also released a brilliant toolkit, and the toolkit's absolutely fabulous, and that only got launched about a month ago. And have a flick through the toolkit. It's got brilliant case studies. So this is about the internal focus of building the capacity and the capability of the profession to deliver savings on embodied carbon through their practice, through their design work.
Thanks.
Just on your question about innovation, what's happening in innovation, I actually think that in every profession you have your innovators. And so it's certainly true in the local government sector, we have local government that are things tend to go around in circles. So someone develops something and then someone takes it a little bit further and someone takes it a little bit further. And so there's always innovators in the profession. And I think one of the roles of professional associations or the collective alliance, whatever it is to enable and bolster and broaden the impact of those innovators. So bring it into the centre to provide some support for it so it can continue and so that it can be adopted by others.
To expand on that, because I think that's what I was going to talk about was, policy is probably our biggest lever. It would be great to have that where it's a mandatory to act and to enact change. But to your point is our members are the innovators. And I think for us, and definitely from an AILA perspective, is climate positive design is one of our values, and it has been for some time, and we've got a number of guidelines and position statements similar, but it really does focus on what our members need to know and the skills that they need because they're advocates on the front line in every project that they do, and they're fighting against policy that may not be necessarily supporting that, or it may not be in the brief. And so, they're extremely frontline advocates changing things on a daily basis. One of our second guidelines is about practices and studios and organisations and what they can do to change the way that they operate, which, I think is that sort of environment that you work and practice. And then our third guideline is the roadmap that AILA uses, and that's around our policy and advocacy. I think to your point about one of the challenges is exhaustion. It's really important that this association's doing that. But we are volunteers, and so that's where that legacy thing comes in, because if our members, and talking, and I think this is the same, is that landscape architects are very values driven, and a lot of them have found their way into this profession because of a values alignment with themselves personally. And so they're fighting the good fight on an individual basis as a practitioner within an industry and potentially as a volunteer within an organisation. And so we have some great advocates, there's some of them in the room, who do that on behalf of the association, but we need to make sure that it's actually a collective kind of advocacy, because otherwise they are they do exhaust. And so we've got to have that sort of legacy of people coming through who are equally, big champions, and it needs to be on multiple scales. So to the point of at a project level, but at a state government, national government, and even to the point where we've got, I think Claire's still on the IFLA, the International Federation Climate Working Group. And so that's us then starting to influence and connect at an international level. To the government point though, and I think this would probably be similar but definitely aligned with Natasha, is we've got a lot of landscape architects working in government. And so it's how do we as an association support those members who are not sort of the traditional landscape architect designing and constructing, but they're in policy, and how do we support them with our CPD and our sort of collective energy behind them, because they're the ones sitting next to policymakers and sort of writing briefs and championing things within government. And so that's, maybe not a overt climate action piece that we do as an association, but by supporting that part of our membership base is actually making sure that they've got the strength of us behind them in terms of what they're trying to change.
I might just build on that because I do think it's quite important, and it touches back on the innovation that you talked about, and the different roles that different associations have. And I'm thinking in terms of innovation of many of you are probably, or some of you might be aware of some work that the City of Melbourne did in developing a tool called the Green Factor tool, and that arose out of a lot of research that was done, including through the University of Melbourne. And it really sought to address, a number of different issues, but one of the fundamental ones was how do you get green infrastructure, which we know is critical for both mitigation and adaptation, into areas that are already heavily urbanised. So you can't just go, okay, we'll plant 3 canopy trees and that's it. So you can't do that. What are the alternatives? And the Green Factor tool essentially lets you kind of benchmark what kind of other infrastructure, whether it's roof gardens or green walls or the like, against a kind of an outcome. So that was work that was done by a local government. They drove that, but its implementation is through planning policy, and its awareness and its knowledge and the industry's take-up of it is through the communication of tools like that by industry bodies like AILA and the like. So I think it's one of those things where when you have innovation, and it touches on what Natasha was saying, is that, we building on those things and kind of all of us doing our little bit to kind of advance things that are being done well, and to kind of, I guess, propagate them across the different areas and spheres of influence that we all have, can be really critically important.
Yeah, that's right. I'm like, yep, you're meeting our principles there in that response. So we'll open it up for questions. We'll have one mic this side, and I'll grab maybe your mic, Paul, for that side. So anyone have a question that they'd like to start with?
Warwick Pattinson. I'm sort of representing a local group here, and I'm really heartened by what I've heard today. But the impression that we have is that there's a huge disconnect between the professions and what the government's doing. That we seem to have a government that's obsessed with projects and is not really interested in planning. What's your experience, and is there hope?
This one's an interesting one, and I want to jump in only because I think this is where the joint advocacy is starting to get a little bit more traction. Landscape architects in particular, we don't have we don't have a minister or a portfolio that we sort of can directly link to, and we have, by nature of what we do, we actually influence a number of policy portfolios. So from transport planning, the environment, education, whatever. And so that spreads us quite thin. But what we've found, and I think this is talking to the joint statements, is that we're starting to get more traction when we've worked together. And so, yes, I'd agree with what you're saying, but I think this kind of joined up approach rather than us all sort of replicating it, because quite frankly, the Minister for Planning, I know, has had conversations with AILA, and then also, a couple of hours later is meeting with the Architects Institute and then planning. And so it's kind of, just a lot of noise. So with, that thought of coming once, doing it very loud and together and, for a longer period of time works. I think that and, just generally the joined up approach. And the other one is for us, whilst there's a built environment part, there's also an ecosystem part. So, with us, we've also joined up with the NGIV and Landscaping Victoria, which is the ecosystem of kind of delivering landscapes and maintaining them and the supply chains. So again, it's that, how do you reach across a number of portfolios and get the traction, because no one portfolio actually really delivers the change in a way, for us anyway.
It's one of the key challenges, that disconnect between what policy and practice kind of tells us we should do and what we see through government reform. I think it's one of the challenges that's probably worth touching on, because I think one of the key frustrations that I have personally, and I think it probably plays out across lots of people attending this symposium, and it was touched on a bit earlier today, but there is a fundamental siloing that occurs, particularly at kind of state government level. It occurs a bit at federal government level too, but particularly at state government level. And one of the really clear examples of that is this absolute failure to consider the climate crisis at the same time that there's a response to the housing crisis. And we've, to be honest, we've written correspondence specifically to ministers on this issue, because in our, from the Institute's point of view, it's a fundamental failure of policy that we're having all of this housing affordability driven reform that's not considering the kind of whole of life cycle affordability, the issues around climate resilience and the like that will come through as a result of some pretty significant reform. And probably another point on that, which is of significant concern to the Institute, and I suspect to others as well, is that the kind of process and the kind of tendencies that have been embedded in a lot of the reform that we've seen recently have been to kind of circumnavigate existing policies and existing processes. So everything's getting fast-tracked through things, we're codifying things, we're taking away notice and review rights. And one of the problems with that is that if you don't get those settings right, and you don't set those benchmarks high enough, and you don't make sure that those benchmarks and those standards, etc., that you're building into your policy and your regulation are actually going to deliver climate resilience, are actually going to deliver the levels of energy efficiency that we need, it's a real problem, and it's a real disconnect. And there seems to be a real critical focus on one part of policy reform, which is, from a planning perspective, is fantastic. Yes, let's get more people living in areas where they've got access to transport and the like. But the whole rest of the kind of climate resilience, the role in terms of mitigation that things like precincts can play, is not part of this reform. And probably most people in this room might not have seen it, but some of the draft standards that have been circulated by the state government in terms of reform to something like Res Code, which is a really critical part of the toolkit that planners have to play with, the quality of responses to climate change have been really appallingly bad. So that's a real concern, and it's a real challenge, and it's certainly an area that we're particularly focused on at the moment. Is that kind of the implications of that siloing of government policy on climate action from government policy on housing affordability? Yeah,
I think there's a couple of interesting elements. I actually think that state governments, I'm a career policy person of 20 years, and I've done a lot of policy work in the human services sector. I do think that actually at state government level, they do whole of government policy responses to issues of the day better than the federal government do. And I think an example around climate action has been the climate action adaptation plans here in Victoria. Now, some of our professional associations would have responded to the built environment plans, But we have to remember, this was a couple of years ago, there were also plans that were done in the justice sector and also done in the health and human services sector. So governments are capable of holistic thinking and doing whole of government responses. And my long observation across a couple of decades is it's done better at the state and territory government level than it is at the federal level. I think the other comment that I would have to make is you've got to get really clever with your advocacy and sometimes don't go for the bleeding obvious. And I just provide this case study, which I'm talking to at our staff meeting tomorrow. And it's two jurisdictions, or two, at both a state government level and a federal government level, there's been these big announcements about NCC freezes. So in fact, the Malinuskas Labor government in July announced an NCC freeze for 10 years as part of its housing roadmap. The MBA in Queensland was lobbying for a freeze also in the lead up to the state election. And then Peter Dutton announced an NCC freeze as part of the coalition's housing policy going into the 2025 federal election. And we've pushed back, but we haven't pushed back talking about energy efficiency or decarbonisation or climate action or livable housing design, which we're also passionate about. Instead, I took the approach in developing the messages for both sets of media releases in relation to the South Australian and the Dutton announcement. I said, let's get them by surprise. So we've come out with messages about how these governments or how the coalition risks leaky, mouldy, defective buildings, the stuff that you see on Current Affairs, that you see in the lo-fi Murdoch press tabloids like the Herald Sun and the Mercury. And in fact, on the same, when we did it with respect to the Dutton announcements, on the same day we got an ABC interview. We got multiple interviews on the radio in South Australia because what are ministers scared of? They're scared of risk and they want to be able to sleep at night. And so when things come up that really entertain risk across a broad perspective of the population, let's face it, you go out there, look on the roads, look how many people are driving large unnecessary utes and SUVs. People actually don't give a rat's, right? They do give a rat's about their energy bill. Oh, but just let's put on some more solar panels. But if you have a conversation with people about the passive performance of their building, but if you tell them that their new house or the extension's going to leak or they're going to have a toxic mould problem, oh hell, I saw that on Current Affairs, then you start to connect with the public mindset. So we have to, as professional associations, representing our really learned professions, learn to know how to speak better to the general public and also to press the buttons of politicians because they will know what the general public are also very sensitive to as well. We have to be very clever, very strategic, very streetwise and very cunning with our advocacy.
And I'll put forward an alternate view, which is to use the levers that you have, right? So 20 years ago, to your question, councils were seeking state government policy on ESD, environmentally sustainable development. And there was a point back in 2002 where the state government was seriously considering it. And then the bushfires happened and it got shelved. And so since then, there's been a concerted effort, and I'm talking about CASBE now, a concerted effort on behalf of Victorian councils to use the levers that they have and to come together in a show of force, because we understand that one council against a development industry isn't much, but 42 councils or even 35 councils is when we started, is something. The state government does sit up. Have we got the policy we want in state government yet? No, we don't. Do we have 27 local policies with exactly the same requirements? Yes, we do. And we have another, 10 councils on top of that implementing the same program without a policy. And we have, goals and targets. And so I think it's about this ability to be adaptive in your advocacy and your work. So, you hit a roadblock. Okay, our roadblock is that the state government hasn't responded to those 24 planning amendments in more than 2 years now. That's our roadblock. How are we going to deal with that? On the 2-year anniversary, we published the standards that we wanted for the first time. And we said, we're launching an industry partnership program. We are going to show you, state government, that there are buildings that are happening out there. There are industry leaders out there already that are doing these standards. Local government isn't leading, industry's leading here, and we're going to show you examples. Will it work? Maybe, maybe not. But in the meantime, we're going to get more and more buildings.
Other questions?
Hi there. Thank you everyone for the panel. It's been a great conversation. You touched, Paul, on, I suppose, bringing the social side into it, and climate action. A lot of people focus on, I suppose, climate change, and there's going to be, you know, increased heat waves, etc., etc. Probably a question for everyone, really. How or if are you advocating for the social side of climate action as well, if you are?
Yeah, I think one of the very important areas, I was actually around, I was working at Aged and Community Care Victoria in the wake of the 2000, in fact, before and after the 2009 bushfires. A lot of people don't know that more people died directly as a result. 367 people died as a result of the heat wave in the week before the Black Saturday bushfires than actually died in the bushfires. So I sat on government advisory groups that were looking at vulnerable Victorians and at the systems for alerting vulnerable Victorians about heat waves, and particularly about human sector organisations such as community aged care providers, ensuring that people had safety plans in place for those high-risk days. So this work's actually been going on for a hell of a long time. So I think, you know, what's really important is that, for example, for the architecture profession has been to say to governments, you know, the way you design your social housing is critically important. If the grid goes down, will the building passively perform enough to protect people? We've also been strong advocates for retrofit programs for existing homes, and particularly for low-income populations and also for social housing. So the idea that, you know, a house is a home, an apartment is a form of shelter, and it has to be designed and constructed adequately to perform well when active systems of heating and cooling do not work.
One of the other example I was going to use to answer the lever question, or your question about what do you do when state government doesn't deliver what you want, is another example of industry professionals using what they can is the Nightingale example, right? Which is an architect-led housing project, which last time I heard from one of the CEO, I think the current CEO, was that they'd managed to deliver 20% social housing in one of their projects in a unfacilitatory process. Are they here? No, I was going to say that. But in doing so, they've also established a community in that process. So those buildings are communities, and the way that they establish and set up those projects are community building, as well as, you know, managing to achieve what they're wanting to achieve within the current regulatory environment.
I think for us, you know, by nature, we're quite public anyway, and so our projects can talk, or we've got that amazing public interface, and so we can demonstrate that. But one of the other big things for us, particularly around advocacy, so, you know, we can write submissions and we can, you know, try and meet with government, etc. But we've got a few other kind of actions, I suppose, that we can do, and one of them is relationships. And so for us, and this has been really driven by our environment committee, is about how do we partner with insurance companies and other people in that sort of health and wellbeing space, because that's giving us the evidence to support why we do our projects. And so between hard academic kind of research, the projects that we've delivered, and those partnerships with sort of, I suppose, maybe slightly unusual partners, particularly for us in those insurance companies, how do we then do, you know, work together in that advocacy? And then again, we're hitting another portfolio at a state level that landscape architects probably don't normally speak to. So it's, you know, if the environment minister's not going to listen to us, we'll go and speak to the health minister, and we'll start doing that. And we did recently took, is it Marianne Thompson, the Minister for Health, we took her on a tour of one of our projects and we started to talk to that. It was interesting that she was like, oh, I think you should be talking to the planning minister, but it gave us that option, or that at least an opening to go, no, actually, this is a health issue. And what we do is a health issue and a health and wellbeing issue, and not even just a medical kind of thing, but a mental health and, community and connection as such. So, it is about, to whoever's point, it's about trying to find the loopholes. And, if we can't get that traction first, then we'll find someone else and we'll go through that.
I just think, Naomi, that's an incredibly great example. So the conversation you can have with a health minister is to say, if we design a cooler urban environment in hot weather, we see across the course of a week, perhaps a couple of thousand less chronically unwell or elderly people admitted to an emergency department, and we all know what emergency departments are like, full with heat stress. What a great example. I think that's fabulous, very commendable.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. When it's on Slido, there's more, hey? Yeah, I'm about to wrap it up, but if you wanted to say one more. I was just going to talk
I just wanted to touch on maybe one of the challenges that we face in terms of industry bodies and advocacy and the like, and I think we've touched on it a little bit before, but one of the challenges, I think, particularly from a planning perspective, one of the challenges is, I think there's this broad awareness that to effectively advocate, you need to find the right narrative, yeah? You need to find the right hook, yeah? To kind of, there's a lot of really hard-baked kind of preconceptions around what's possible or not possible, etc. So you got to find this hook that kind of gets them in and lets you have that conversation. One of the challenges, I think, from a planning perspective is that often there is not really a hook that you can summarise in a couple of words, because there's what we deal with are really complex systems, and just saying, oh, you just can do that. We need to add about 17 different caveats, but you have to make it do this and you have to do this. And so it can sometimes be, I think, a real challenge. And I don't personally know the answer to that, other than continuing to have conversations with people that involve more than just a single line, because I think from an advocacy perspective, that is one of those real challenges when you're working in complex systems and you're working with things like climate change that have so many implications and so many connections to kind of so many different parts of our society and our environment and the like, trying to kind of dumb it down so someone, someone understands it who might have a kind of a natural bias towards wanting to understand it. Can be really, really hard. And I don't know the answer to that, but it's definitely something that I'm grappling with as a challenge.
Thanks, Jane. It's unfortunately time to bring this discussion to a close. So before we do, though, I wondered if you had one last parting comment for the audience.
I have a question, and that is, how many of you are members of your professional association? Because, in fact, the opportunity to have voice is actually quite easy. And it's not just about policy wonks like me and presidents like Jane and Naomi. It's actually about members on the ground. Join. For example, at the Institute, we have SONA, we have our student network, we've got our emerging architecture and graduates network. There is lots of opportunities to get involved. Don't see it as, the ivory towers of the Institute, whether it's the Planning Institute or AILA or the Australian Institute of Architects. It's actually really easy to participate in your membership body. And so please join.
And I think we would second that. But also, if you're not a member or you're not a landscape architect, but you think that there is something that we need to know about or you need us to get behind it, then reach out. And I think, you know, Jane and I have had conversations like that where, you know, we hadn't been informed about some of the res code and she was like, did you see this? You need to write about this. And I was like, oh my God, you know, my brain at the time wasn't really coping. So literally it was just you know, this is what I'm worried about. Our landscape architects worried about this as well. And so reading what she's put forward and go, yes, actually, we'll get behind that. So I think the important thing is we don't always have to come up with the narrative either. But if, you know, we look to our allied professions as well, and members. So yes, we need members because the collective is always powerful, but also architects, planners, academics, whoever, policy people, community can also come to us and sort of go, hey, did you know about this? You know, are you angry? And what are you going to do about it?
No, that's okay. Very similar to the others. It's sometimes hard from the outside to see what a professional association does, and I've worked for two, and I know that that's the feedback that we get. I think there's the key for the professional association is to engage their members, and your carbon example, your carbon training example is a really good example, but also there's power in numbers. So if you're wanting to affect change and you're frustrated by a systemic barrier, there's power in numbers to bring about that change.
I was just going to say that's absolutely, that resonates for me. I mean, that's why I got involved in PIA. I got involved because I came across systemic barriers in my practice, and as a result of those systemic barriers, which I couldn't change through my practice, I chose to get involved in my industry association because there is absolutely power in that. And there's also power in those partnerships because all of the different perspectives. So, you know, I'm a practicing strategic planner, but what PIA does, just in and of itself, is brings together planners who work in local government, who work for big developers, who work for state government, who work for practice. So you get all of those different perspectives and they all make your policy positions much more robust. And then you reach out and you talk to other industry associations and those perspectives make your policy and your advocacy more robust again. And all of those things reinforce your professional practice and the level of change that you're able to deliver through both your practice and your industry association.
So in my opinion, really inspiring work going on. So if you're feeling a bit depressed about climate change and the graphs I showed earlier, know that there is a lot of work going on and get involved. And thank you please join me in thanking our panellists.